Hey, what's up? Andrew Kramer here for VideoCopilot.net, and welcome back to another very exciting tutorial. Today, we're going to be taking a look at some visual effects compositing. We've got Sam Loya, we've got explosions, debris, trains flying through the air, pretty much everything you can ask for in a tutorial. Unless you're Sam Loya and you probably just want some, workers' compensation or, maybe like a sandwich or a break even. But you know what? Let's go and take a look at what we're going to be creating. Okay, so we've got this train exploding, debris flying everywhere, and then it lands and blows up into pieces. Now, some of you might remember this tutorial from a while ago, and here's what happened. It was going to be a set extension tutorial. We're going to just, take a look at some cool compositing, some cool tracking, but I didn't feel like it was exciting enough, so I actually added an explosion, and I thought, okay, this is cool, this is fun, he's running. But when I came back to it, I saw the explosion and thought, what is this, an explosion for kids? Is this like a kids train safety video? Because I just didn't feel like it had enough excitement. If my kids saw this, they'd probably be embarrassed for me. So you can thank my kids. A little bit of shame can go a long way. All right, let's go and get started. Inside of our project, we have the train shot of Sam Loya jumping down and running past the camera. We're going to go ahead and drop this onto the new comp button. And what we need to do is motion track the shot. So normally we can use the built-in tracker, the point tracker. But because we have Mocha for After Effects, we're going to go ahead and jump over there and track it a little bit better than using a point tracker. So inside of Mocha, we're going to load our clip. Train shot, hit open, and make sure this is all set right, 23.976, and we'll hit OK. Mocha works a little bit different than the point tracker. It actually does planar tracking, so it tracks surfaces and texture. So what we're going to do is take the spline tool, and we're going to track a chunk of the image around this place here. So we kind of want to track the background a little bit. And once we create our spline, we want to make sure to avoid Sam the best we can. So we're going to try to keep this above where he's running. And then we're going to go ahead and push this track forward button. When that's finished, we can go and scrub through this and see everything looks pretty good. And we can go back to our original keyframe and then track backwards. And one of the great things about Mocha is it actually does a pretty good job of tracking stuff that goes out of the frame. So it's it's a nice tool. We'll go and track it here a little further. Just enough. There we go. Just enough to where the train that's gone will cover the entire shot. So this is what we want. We're going to go to the very first frame. Now we're going to be using the tracking data a little bit differently than usual. What I want to do is click Align to Surface at the very front. So what that's going to do is set our corner pin data to be perfectly aligned to this first frame. Then what I want to do is come over here and choose Export Tracking Data. And what we're going to do is set this to After Effects corner pin only. So we don't want to have any motion blur or motion. Now if you're in CS6 Mocha for AECS6, just make sure you choose corner pin only. And we're going to go ahead and copy to clipboard. Then we're going to jump back into After Effects and we're going to create a new solid. And we'll just call this a corner pin track. And we'll go to the very beginning here and we'll choose Edit, Paste. If we hit U, it's going to bring up the keyframes on our timeline. Now, if we click on the effects control and the corner pin effect, we can actually see that once we get down here to where the motion begins, we can see that everything is moving as it should. This isn't particularly helpful as far as, setting things up and putting them into our shot. However, we don't want to use the corner pin data. Instead, we're going to use the Video Copilot Magic Tracking preset. So what we're going to do, come back up here to the animation preset. So download the project for this tutorial, and inside we have the Video Copilot folder, which has a couple of presets. One particular one is called Corner Pin to Null. And you can check out the magic tracking tutorial. And what we're going to do is create a null object. And we're going to take the corner pin to null effect and drop it on that null object. Then we're going to choose the track layer. So what happens is it adds a couple of effects. And we want to set this to corner pin track. So we're going to select the layer that has our corner pin data. Now I'm going to shut the corner pin track layer off, and I'm going to scrub through the video here. And as I do this, we're going to see that that null object begins to move. See that? What I'm going to do is take that null object and drag it over here closer to where I want to composite some effects. I'm going to put it right around here. Now notice that track point stays exactly where it needs to be. Instead of having to track this point exactly, or this point exactly, or this point exactly, by using the corner pin data from Mocha, I can actually use our preset to essentially work like a dynamic tracker. So wherever I put this null object, I'm going to get perfect tracking data as long as it's within the realm of the area that we tracked in Mocha. All right, but what can we do with this null object? Well, check this out. I have this train extension. So I'm going to bring this out, just a little paint job of some additional train cars that I want to composite into the scene. It's not perfect, but I'm going to stick it in there, and I'm going to align it, and then I'm going to parent this layer to the null object. Now it's going to be locked on to that position. I can turn the motion blur on. So we're getting nice motion blur, even though we're technically using corner pin data. Our preset is actually doing a bunch of crazy calculations. I don't know what all this means. I want to thank Sergio for this. Now, why is this method better than a single point? Well, it's planar tracking. So it actually averages the entire surface to come up with the data. So it's more accurate than just trying to do a single point track. So there's a lot of good reasons to use this method for your 2D tracking needs. This is the basic idea, and in fact, this could be the basis for a complete tutorial. But we're going to take it to the next level with some flying train cars and all that good stuff. But before we start having fun, we've got to handle Sam's head here. So we can do it two ways. We can roto him out, or we can roto his head out in the previous shots so that he doesn't have a head the whole time. Tell you what, let's just go ahead and roto Sam on top. One thing I want to show you is the null object has the expressions on it and stuff. Now keep in mind that these expressions are calculating every single frame. So it's pretty fast, like we don't feel like it's slow, but it can actually be a little bit slow, especially when calculating the motion blur, because it has to, figure out the previous calculations and stuff. And what we can do is bake all of the keyframes. So instead of being dynamic values, they're going to be absolute. So if we select all the parameters, we can choose animation, keyframe assistant, convert expression to keyframe. And now we have actual keyframes. And this works, by the way, for any kind of property that has an expression on it. And if we need to go back to it, we can just click on this little equal button and it'll go back to the expression. So it's still dynamic, but this will actually speed things up a little bit. Back to rotoscoping. So let's just call this track point. And because all of our layers are red, let's change that to yellow. And let's start rotoing. So we'll take the background layer, train shot, hit Control D or Edit Duplicate. And we'll put this on top here. And we'll call this Roto. Now, what we need to do is track Sam out probably from about this point. I'll hit the star till he runs out of the frame. So that's not a very long, range. It's about, 32 frames. What we need to do is almost frame by frame cut him out. Now, it's only 30 frames, but he's running and his jacket's flying everywhere, so we have to, take our time. So what we can do is just zoom in and start on one part of his head. So we can just start on his head, his nose, and then hit M. That's going to bring up our keyframe. We're going to hit the stopwatch for his head, and then we'll move forward a bit and move this into place, and we can double click on it and scale it down as he runs. And we just need to move the points to keyframe the animation. So we're going to move forward a bit more. Now, usually you want to work on specific parts one at a time. So we work on his head, and then we work on his shoulders and his upper body. So we might do something like this. Maybe, include his legs here. And just make sure we keyframe it here. And then we want to go and do each of his arms and then just go through it until you're finished with the animation. Now, luckily for you, I've actually already finished it, and here it is. So I've rotoscoped it just like I described. You can see I just worked on specific parts at a time, and then he runs out of the shot. Now, this is actually why the tutorial took so long to make, because I was working on this roto for like 6 months, but it looks pretty good. Now, one of the cool things about rotoing with After Effects is that if you set the layer to have motion blur and you turn the motion blur on, you can actually see that it does the motion blur for you for the motion. So you can turn that on and off while you're rotoing to refine those edges. Now in this case, this is going to work pretty well. We've got our roto here. Now it's on top. So if I turn our train set extension back on and hide everything, Control-Shift-H. As I scrub through this, you can see now his head is on top of our train set extension, and he can run by. Now, moreover, I can actually take, various elements from the Action Essentials kit, like a car bomb, and, I can align this, maybe scale it down, and then parent it to the track point. Turn the motion blur on, for example, and we can see that we're starting to get somewhere. We're starting to see what this could be and how this technique can be used. For example, maybe you're throwing some sparks out there. So we'll set this to add. Got some sparks. We're putting some smoke. Maybe some bits of debris or whatever. This might be all you need to know. So right here, wrap that up into your mind as far as a technique that you can use to composite 2D elements into your tracked footage. But we're going to take it to the next level with some 3D animated footage, and then jump into compositing these elements together and really making them look nice. So let's go and delete those and start talking about the 3D aspect of the shot. Okay, let's go and talk about this train that's flying through the air and all of the debris and destruction. Now, it was actually created inside of 3ds Max, and then we rendered out the frames and brought them into After Effects. Now, this tutorial series has all of the steps to create this inside of 3D Max in a separate tutorial, just as we're going to be talking about the fume effects simulations in a separate tutorial. So if you want to be able to create those things on your own, check those tutorials out. But for everyone who's watching this, I want to give you an idea of what that entails. So let's go ahead and jump over to 3ds Max, and we can just talk about how the project is set up so that you can understand how this all works. First thing I did is I took a still frame of the background of the trains, and I brought it inside of 3D Max and placed it in the background. So that's going to help us align things and figure out the size of this world. Now, the next thing I did was used a tool called Rayfire to simulate the pieces flying and then landing. So what's cool about it is it's like a rigid body simulation tool. And these are the only pieces that I simulated. So these ones actually bounce and topple. But on top of this, I actually emitted more particles from these smaller bits of debris. So using a tool called particle flow, I was actually able to emit more particles. And these are basically all of the small chunks of pieces that go flying everywhere. Because one, to try to simulate all of those smaller pieces takes a lot longer and can cause some errors. So by using particle flow, they're not as accurate, but for flying bits of debris, it actually works out pretty well. Once the animation is set up, you render it out and then you import it back into After Effects. So let's jump back over into After Effects and take a look at what the render looks like. So we'll come over here into our train shot and we'll go to the 3D render. What we have here is our train car flying with debris everywhere, and we can go ahead and drop this into our project. So we're going to move this over, set the resolution down to half. And what I want to do is align this with this train car. So we'll hit S and we'll scale it up a little bit. And then I want to parent it to that track point. So there it goes, and all we need now are some explosions. There's a couple of different ways we can do this. One, we can use the Action Essentials 2 elements, such as the car bomb or various explosions as part of this collection. Or we could create a CG explosion using something like fume effects. Now, in some cases, you're going to need a custom CG explosion using something like fume effects. Doing CG explosions aren't necessarily easy or fast, but I do want to show you how it works so that you understand the workflow, and I'll be having a dedicated fume effects tutorial as part of this series. So luckily, we've already rendered out the simulation and we have it ready inside of After Effects. So if we come over here to the explosion simulations, here we have a couple of different simulations. So you can see that they look a little bit puffy. They don't quite look photorealistic just yet. But hopefully we can take a look at some color correction tips that'll make it look a lot better. Let's come back into our comp here and let's take our first explosion simulation and drop it underneath our train. Then we'll slide it over here a bit, scale it up. And let's go ahead and parent it to the track point. There we go, explosion, and then the piece falls down. So we actually want the explosion to already be in motion once we get to it. So there we go. Now, how do we get this explosion to look a little bit more realistic? Well, a better question is, what does a realistic explosion look like? Even stock footage explosions sometimes need color correction to look realistic. Let's jump over to Google Images and look at some real explosions. Here we have some air show explosions, and you can see there's a lot of cool different images. And pretty much on the internet you can find anything exploding. We could type in watermelons. We've got watermelons exploding. This could be a dangerous search. So actually, let's not look anymore. But we'll just take a look at these explosions. So we can look at the fire and we can see how it looks. We can click on one of these images and we can compare them and use them as reference. So if we come over here to After Effects, I've actually imported one of these explosions. What I can do is double click on it and then drag the panel over to the right side and try to show both of these at the same time. So we can just compare them essentially. Now, this explosion is a little bit later on, so we want ours to be a little bit brighter in the beginning, but this is a good reference. So let's take our explosion, let's solo it, and let's start color correcting it. So the first thing you might think is, okay, it's just too bright, so let's just try to darken it. So we say curves and we try to darken it down a bit. But it doesn't quite work because the explosion doesn't necessarily just need to be darker, but the gradients and the color need to be remapped or adjusted. So let's instead take the hue and saturation effect and start playing with it that way. Now let's switch it to the red channel. And this is going to affect just the red tones and pixels on this image. What we can do is bring the lightness down and turn the saturation up a bit. Then we can actually adjust the tone so that it's a little bit more red, a little bit more vivid. Maybe darken it down even more. Then we can go to the yellow channel and maybe brighten it up, turn the saturation up a bit. And there we go. So already you can tell this is starting to look a lot better than this. And we've added in a lot more of that fiery detail. We can maybe go to the red channel, do a little bit more tweaking. So this is already looking really good. Another thing we can do is now add that same curves adjustment to add some contrast back in, so we can tweak it just a bit. Obviously, this is getting our explosion to look like this explosion, but the key is to get our explosion to look like it matches our composite. So let's go and unsolo this and start playing around with how the fire should look in this particular shot. So I'm thinking maybe it's a little bit too yellow. The green channel is a good place to adjust once you're inside. And this will just help you kind of tweak the values into either yellow or red. All right, so this looks pretty good, but maybe a little bit too saturated. So let's say if we take the red channel and maybe just drop it down just a bit, add a little bit more contrast essentially, and then let's add another hue and saturation on top. Then if we go to the yellow channel, instead of being so yellow and orange, let's see if we can drop some of that out. So let's bring the saturation down. Now the only problem is that when you bring the saturation down, it starts to look a little bit gray. So when we bring the saturation down, we want to bring the lightness back up. So that's going to actually make it a little bit more white hot and, you know, just seem a little bit more natural looking, so we can see the difference here. All right, so I think this is a pretty good starting point. We're going to be adding some glow and all that stuff later on, but I'd say this is a good starting point for what we need. Let's go and turn our train back on. And so we can see it falling and crashing. Now, we do have some color issues here that we should probably work on a little more, like the green in the smoke. We could probably go to the, let's see, the green channel and maybe tweak this a bit. Blue channel and just that's a little bit better. So we just want to be careful not to introduce too much color cast as we're trying to color correct just the fire. And now that we switched that, what we can do is go back to this other hue and saturation and go to the red channel and maybe bring the lightness down, which not only will make it darker in the reds, but it also make it a little more desaturated. So it'll start to look a little bit more smoky sooner. So that looks pretty good. Okay, we can tweak this color correction a lot later. Let's go ahead and add the explosion when our tanker falls down on the ground. So it's going to hit and we want to explode again. So we've got this second simulated explosion, which is very similar. It's actually from the same simulation, just a slightly different camera angle and a little bit more round looking. What we're going to do is bring this out and slide it over here. And I'm actually going to take the color correction from this effect, hold down Shift, and then choose Edit, Copy, and then take our other explosion and Edit, Paste. So that way we have our explosion, and then we can parent this back to our track point. close the viewer here. When you're dealing with CG explosions, the other issue that you have to worry about is time remapping. You know, we want to make sure that this explosion pops on at the right time. The other thing we have to worry about is these edges being a little bit too dark just because of the way that the fire simulation renders. Let's take a look at solving that problem. To work on this edge, what I'm going to do is pre-compose. So choose Layer, Pre-compose. So it's at the bottom of the list there. We're going to choose Pre-compose, leave all the attributes. We're going to call this Explosion version 2, hit OK, and then we're going to double click on it. What I want to do is color correct just the edge of the explosion. So if we look at the background here, we can see we have an alpha channel. I'm going to go ahead, create an adjustment layer, and this is going to allow us to do our color correction. And then I'm going to take our explosion and duplicate it, Control D. We're going to put our copy above the adjustment layer, and we're going to take the adjustment layer and set it to alpha inverted. So right now, the adjustment layer is going to color correct just the outside area of the explosion where there are no pixels. But if I take the explosion matte layer, we'll call this explosion matte, I can choose Effect, Blur, Fast Blur, give it a little bit of a blur. And now, if we look at that layer, the color correction now will affect a little bit of the overlapping edge. So if I take a color correction here, you can see I can color correct just that edge. Now, if I tweak the blur amount, you can see I can change how much of the edge is affected. I can also take a curves adjustment and adjust the alpha output. So if I were to solo the layer and look at it by itself, I could take the alpha channel and say, make it harder or softer. And this will allow you to control how much of the edge is selected and how soft that edge is. So if we shut that off, what I want to do is brighten the edge up, which means I want our alpha channel to be nice and wide. So if we just tweak the settings here. Okay, so now we've color corrected the edge, but we don't want to color correct it the whole time. So we'll take the adjustment layer, hit T, and we'll keyframe it so that it fades out as the darker smoke fades in. So now if we go back to our comp, we can see that the edge of the explosion is a little bit brighter, and we can even color correct it using the adjustment layer and maybe add a little red back into the edge, maybe match the color a little bit better. In fact, we can lock the layer, click on this layer, and then tweak it in real time, so we can tweak it while we look at it. So I think that looks pretty good, and then we can just unhook it there. We've got the barrel coming down, or the tanker coming down, and the explosion we want to start at about this point in time. Now, we might want to time remap this. So what we can do is right-click, choose Time, enable time remapping, and this will allow us to speed the explosion up. So maybe at this point in time, we could set a keyframe and then take the first keyframe and slide it over so that it happens a little bit faster. So then we can shrink the head of this, move forward, and then slide this over. Of course, we want the time remap to be smooth. So if we click on the graph editor, we can right click, let's see, we'll choose Animation, Keyframe Assistant, Ease In, and then we can tweak this handle so that it's in line with the out velocity. And this is time. This is a temporal velocity, so it's a constant speed here. All right, so boom, hits down, boom. All right, let's go and scale this up as it is pretty close to us. Okay, so this is pretty rough looking, but I think it gives us a good idea on what we need to do. So this explosion is definitely looking like it's just right on top of our background. So we want to adjust that. We don't want the explosion to look like it's composited on top. We want it to feel like it's integrated. So for that, we've actually rendered out in our 3D render a Z depth pass. So this has some depth information. It's hard to see, but it'll let us composite things within that 3D space. So we have a tutorial called depth compositing that you should check out. Shows you how to use this technique, and we're just going to run through it really quick. So we've got our second explosion here, and we want it to be integrated with our train element. Let's duplicate the train, then take the Z pass, hold down Alt or Option on a Mac, and drag it down and let it go. And as long as you hold down Alt, it'll actually swap it. So now we have those two elements in exactly the same position. Then we'll choose Effect Exposure, and then Effect Color Correction Levels. So what we'll do is take the levels, crush this down really, really, really tight. Then we can tweak the exposure position. So this will allow us to select a slice, but we have to tighten the levels up. So it's going to be very, very close together here. And then we just use the exposure to adjust the position. We'll take this, turn this off, put this above the explosion here. Take our explosion, hit F4, and set the track matte to be Luma Matte Inverted. So it's the bottom option there. So check this out. Our matte layer looks like this, is allowing the explosion to sort of seep through. Now, if I take this matte, so we'll call this Z matte, and tweak the exposure, check this out. I'm allowing it to slide around as if it's interacting with this train car. This really makes it look more realistic. And then we can animate the position. So we can animate it as if it's exploding. Let's see here. We can try to smooth it out a bit here. So we can animate the exposure, set the keyframe, move forward, and then animate it forward. And the glow and all of the debris and everything that's going to be composite is going to help sell this. Now, if the edge gets a little bit too jagged, we can just add a quick fast blur to the matte. Okay, so it's flying, it lands, it explodes, and we just want to work on this a little bit more, smooth it out. So we take our explosion. First of all, it's exploding, so it's obviously too dark. This is where we want to start finessing the explosion. So what we'll do is take the exposure effect, put it above all of the color correction, and what we're going to do is keyframe it. So we'll set a keyframe for the gamma and the exposure and move to the beginning and maybe just turn the brightness up. The gamma too, to get rid of... All right, so we've got the basic idea here. We've got the first explosion and then our secondary explosion. And now we just need to layer in some additional elements to make it look more realistic. What we're going to do is come over to our project. I've got some debris, a CG element of some debris flying at the camera. And I'm going to go ahead and drop this in underneath the roto. So if we slide this over to right when the tanker crashes down, we can have this debris sort of shooting out. So I'll trim the first couple of frames, maybe put it right underneath. Maybe scale it up a little bit. There we go. Just want to have things flying everywhere. I'm going to go and extend my project comp. So let's just go to the comp settings, set this to about 150. That way I have a little bit more room to zoom in and move around here. All right, so we've got the debris flying. And as I mentioned earlier, adding in additional live action elements like our Action Essentials dust is going to really help bring this animation together. So we'll come over here to the Action Essentials 2 elements. And let's jump in here and let's take maybe one of these dirt charges, say number 20 here. It's kind of this dirt kicking up and debris flying. And let's see if we can put that maybe as the tanker hits down and kicks up some dirt right before the explosion. So let's bring this out underneath the explosion. And I'm going to take our train. Remember, we created the Z mat earlier. Let's duplicate that, place it above the dirt charge, and let's use that as a mat for the dirt charge as well. So we'll set this to Luma inverted for the track mat. It's at the bottom there. And let's see. There we go. Kicks up this dirt. So right there is about when it's hitting down. So maybe that looks pretty good. So we'll take the Z mat and let's slide the exposure forward a little bit so that we get it sort of interacting with the ground. Okay, so that's pretty good. We'll go ahead and tweak some of these a little bit later. Let's make sure that we parent these effects to our null object. So let's parent this to the track point, and also our debris. Let's make sure that we also parent that to the track point. And that will make sure that these pieces look like they're staying on the ground. Okay. Now, another cool element is our dust wave elements. So this is just some cool looking dust coming at the camera. We can go ahead and put these above the roto and scale it up here. Or actually, let's put them underneath the roto and then maybe put another one on top after the dust fills the screen. So we'll parent this to our track point, slide this over. We also want to make sure that we feather the edge a little bit. So if we take the rectangle mask tool, we can just select the inside area of this dust and then hit F and then feather it a bit. And then we can hit T and lower the opacity. So T is kind of a good shortcut to know. You're always using it just to blend things in here. So let's go and just preview this explosion, make sure the motion feels right. So I'll hit 0 here. All right, so it's not too bad. One of the things I want to do is take that top edge and feather it. So we'll come down to the dirt charge, take our mask tool and just feather this out, hit F and soften that and then subtract it. You don't want any matte lines or hard edges. All right, so this is looking pretty good. Now, a couple of other things. I mean, a lot of this is going to be repetitive, so I'll just show you some of the things to think about. For example, in the background here, maybe we want to add some more dust as well. So we might take that dust element, slide it over, maybe scale it down a bit and lower the opacity. And, you know, we could flip it even, just grab it and flip it so that it doesn't look like the other one. All right, so another thing we want to do is take the trains in the foreground here and block the background explosion. So let's just take a look here. We've got our original shot here. This explosion should be happening behind this train car. So what we need to do is create a mask to separate that. So let's duplicate our train footage. I'm going to hit Edit, Duplicate, or Control D, and let's move that up above the explosion right here. And then we're going to take a new solid, and we'll call this train mat, and we'll hit OK. And then let's take the mat and put it right above the train shot that we just copied. And then we're going to take the train mat and parent it to our track point. So what that's going to do is make it so that this black solid is staying put. So as we move, it's going to stay locked onto it. So what we want to do is turn the eyeball off here, and we want to draw an outline around this part of the train. Come in here. Okay. Then we take the train shot and set it to alpha matte. What that's going to do is put our train in front. All right, so you can see the basic idea. The explosion is now pretty much behind the train car, but we probably want to work on this mask a little bit more. So let's solo the layer, and then we'll zoom in here and maybe tweak this mask a little bit. So maybe just expand it here. And we could use some additional masks to add back in parts of the train. You know, you just want to spend some time to, you know, draw around all these shapes so that we can include it in our mat. Now, for this top part, it's going to be a little bit tricky because there's a lot of small detail. Let me show you how I'd fix that. What I'm going to do is take the train and the mat, hold down Control, select them, and then choose Duplicate. Then I'm going to take the top copy of the mat, hit M, and I'm going to delete the mask. Then I'm going to take the pen tool, and I'm going to draw a shape around the area I want to isolate. So this is the area I want to add back in. Okay, what I need to do now is key out the blue area behind it, the sky. So we'll choose Effect, Key, Color Range. I like color range because it gives you some options to add, subtract. So we're going to take this, click on this blue color, and it gets rid of a lot of it. We can turn up the fuzziness here. And we can see that we're beginning to, you know, get rid of some of that, that edge. Now I am losing a little bit of this, so what I might do is go to the other mat on the first copy and just try to add that part back in. So if you can't control it in one, just add it back in another one. So that's kind of the trick with keying. You want to kind of layer these things together. So let's turn this all back on, and now we have this top train part. It's got a little bit of blue in it. We could maybe soften it a little bit more. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. I might color correct that a little bit. We could try doing a color correction to get rid of some of that blue edge. So maybe just darkening down the image a bit. Maybe playing with the alpha channel, maybe softening it a bit. Okay, so that's not too bad. That hides it a little bit. And, you know, the motion's going to be going pretty fast. Now, this mask is a little bit sharp around the edge, so if we maybe feather it, maybe 2 pixels, 1 pixel here. Again, it's going to get blurred out when we turn the motion blur on. So if we turn the motion blur on, so it's going to look a lot better once we turn on the motion blur and all the final settings. And even this background explosion, we could probably turn the motion blur on for it so that when everything's happening, it's blending in really nicely. So if that doesn't look right with the motion blur off, it's just to speed things up while we work. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. We might want to work on this area, smooth this out a little bit more in the composite. So another thing that we can do, we've got the dust, but another thing we can do to help this area and also help blend areas that are in front and behind is to add some additional elements. So one of the elements I like to use are these slow sparks. Just some cool looking sparks. We can take these, bring them out, put them above some of this stuff, and time it. I'll set the transfer mode to like add or screen, and then let's desaturate it a bit. So I'm going to use the tint effect. There we go. Always color correct your elements. Let's scale this down a bit, and then we can time it near the initial explosion. So let's put it like here, and let's parent it to our track point. So boom, we've got our sparks here. So what's cool about this is it helps kind of integrate this front train car. And again, we could do some feathering. We could even add some fire elements as well. So we've got some various fire elements that are burning. Could take a few of these and parent them to our track point. Set it to screen and maybe scale it down a bit. Now, one thing about the sparks is they actually look pretty good. They actually look like they're going in the right direction. But sometimes you might have stock footage, and the stock footage doesn't quite move the right way. And don't feel like you're limited to just that direction. There's some really cool ways you can manipulate stock footage without making it look unrealistic. So let me show you. If I take this spark element, what I could do is use a distort effect like liquefy or even mesh warp. And what this allows you to do, let's set this down to like 4x4. What this allows you to do is move some Bezier points to help shape the flow of the stock footage. So if I wanted it to kind of seem like it's wrapping around this tanker, I could tweak this a bit and and get it to somewhat move the way I want. So just playing around with these, and as long as you don't distort it too much, it can actually look quite realistic. So you can see the sparks kind of roll around that tanker a little bit. So things like fire, things that have a flow to them can usually be manipulated in this way, and that way you can kind of direct the elements after the fact. Let's go and add some glowing to these explosions. So we're going to do it with an adjustment layer. So we'll put it on top. We'll come over here. We'll choose Effect, Stylize, and Glow. All right, this looks pretty good, but I think we can do a little bit better. So let's come over here to the glow. Let's turn the threshold up. And let's come down here, change the glow from just using the original colors to AB colors, which will be down here. And let's switch these to sort of a warm, fiery tone. And then we want to set the transfer mode to screen. So then we'll crank this up a bit. Okay, so there we can start to see the glow, and you want to be careful with the threshold because we don't want to blow the sky out here, but so I'll just get some of that basic glowing happening. Then let's duplicate the glow so we have 2 copies. Then we're going to set this glow to be a lot softer than the first glow. And so now if we kind of start looking at our fire, now this particular one is starting to glow a little bit. I want to maybe take that fire element, so let's come down here to the first explosion, and I want to make it look a little bit hotter and a little bit brighter. So the way I can do that is duplicate this hue and saturation, and I'm going to reset it, and then I'm going to go to the yellow channel, and I'm going to brighten it up a bit. So that's going to have a direct impact on our glow. Now we do want to be careful, our sky is starting to get a little bit blown out because it's also pretty bright. One thing I could do is just do a quick adjustment layer, almost like an ND filter. Let's put it above that and maybe just bring the brightness down. So just bring it down just a touch and then feather it out just so it's just that top portion, and then hit F and I'll feather this. So we've just added kind of like a photographic ND filter to the top of that area. So coming back here, we've got our explosion. Maybe we bring some of the saturation out of it and bring the lightness up. And this is where you can start finding that right color tone for your explosions, finding that right intensity. So now we can come back to our glow and tweak the settings here. So this is looking pretty good. We can crank that up a bit. Come down here to this larger glow and maybe make it a lot wider, a lot brighter. And then we've got our secondary explosion. So again, we're going to want to color correct some of the yellow out of this explosion. So we'll go down here to that explosion right here. And I'll just duplicate the hue and saturation, reset it, go to the yellow channel, and then maybe desaturate it a bit. We can even kind of hue shift it a bit. This is looking just a little bit too yellow again. Maybe we'll come back up here, bring the intensity down just a touch. So as it hits, it's going to blow up and sort of fill with all of the yellow. Now, in this particular frame, it doesn't look like our explosion's bright enough. So if we take our explosion, we can maybe crank up the exposure here so that it really blows out, which will make it look like a very hot, very powerful explosion. And even going into some of these beginning frames and just giving them a nice white hot intensity. So just kind of going back and forth. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. We could do maybe some more color correction on top of this. Just add a little bit of contrast back in. Now that everything is a little bit washed out from the glow, And yeah, it's got a nice intensity to it. We can, tweak the intensity of the glow two ways. You can brighten the explosions so that they create more glow, or you can turn up the glow amount. So depending on, how you need to balance your scene, those are two good methods for finding that right look. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. And then for the initial blast, and maybe some screen effects, what you might do is one of our plugins we have is called optical flares. And what we can do is bring that out and load a preset real quick. So we could come over here, we could load in, pretty much any one of these presets, and we have some lens textures. And turn up the brightness a bit. We can set the transfer mode to like add, for example. And for that initial explosion, we could have, we can tint the flare a little bit so it's a little more warm. And we can flash the lens flare on as well as kind of animate the position here. And just keyframe the brightness of the lens flare, so we can keyframe it to fade it out. And so we just get sort of this initial blast. Maybe even blur it out. One of the things we could do is just switch the lens texture. So right now, we're using this dodgy one. You can switch it to another one like this dirty one. It's got some cool, soft looking out of focus elements. And that's kind of a nice look. Turn that brightness up a bit. Even maybe we'll just do a screen mode. Give it some more color. So that's kind of a nice look. I like just having the off-screen explosion just to kind of give you that sense of something happening outside of the frame. And we could even add just like a slight glow to it if we wanted to just soften it up a bit. We don't want to necessarily have like a specific point where it's coming out of, but it's up to you. And another thing you could do with this lens flare plugin is we can actually just clear the whole preset, and then we can just add a texture back in all by itself. So what that's going to allow us to do is just have some screen smudge at that point in time when, maybe a big explosion goes off. So when this front explosion goes off, maybe we just fade this on a little bit. And, and fade it out. So we've kind of created a little on-lens grime that shows up. Maybe color correct this one a little bit. So that's just one thing that you can do with optical flares that doesn't involve actually adding a lens flare into your shot. Anyways, I know this has been a long tutorial. I really wanted to go in depth, focus on all the little details that sometimes get glossed over in training, and just show you how much work and how much little details go into each of these little shots. And also just, bringing together different programs, different software, different plugins, different stock footage, and how all of these elements together can help you achieve some impressive visual effects. So even if you're not necessarily into 3D or into some of these other programs, it's really great to know how it all works together and what it takes to put some of these shots together. All right, let's go and take a look. My name is Andrew Kramer. Thank you guys for watching this tutorial. Have some fun, and we'll see you next time. Just sit back, relax, and get ready for some explosive training. All right, that's a terrible pun. It's easy to get derailed with all this excitement going on. But rest assured, I'm going to get us back on track. All right, is that all? Crossroads, fall off the wagon? Nope, we're good.